So it is 9:01 a.m. This is the meeting of the Zoning Ordinance Advisory Committee. Thank you all for being with us today. Ms. May, can we start with the roll call?
Chair Hampton,
Present.
Vice Chair Blair,
Present.
Ms. McGregor. Okay, that's it. Mr. Hall,
Present.
Mr. Reeves,
Here.
Mr. Berry,
Here.
and Commissioner Prosecutor, is she? And is Ms. Bagley on there?
Circle back on them as we start. So thank you all. We have a quorum. Is that a verbal yes?
Yes.
We have 5. Yeah, 5 of 8. Thank you. And we have one discussion item on our agenda today. Ms. Levy, could you please read the item into the record and begin with your briefing?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, committee members. The item that we have this morning is DCA 212003, and this is consideration of amending concrete or asphalt batching plant uses, including but not limited to industrial uses in the Dallas Development Code.
Thank you. Yes. Please begin. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a fairly lengthy presentation, but I'm going to go through a lot of it very quickly so that we can hit the highlights and get to the important matters. Our timeline, if everyone would just recall, we started back in November of 2021, and this all came up at the request of Councilmember Blackman, the chair of the Environment and Sustainability Committee. And she asked staff to address strategies to effectively address the batch plants. So back in the beginning of 2022, staff prepared a memo and laid out a 2-phased approach. And so we took phase 1 through the process, and that was approved by City Council on May 11th, 2022. And that was to require the public process with public hearings and requiring the SUP or specific use permit for all temporary and permanent batch plants. So, and at that time, we said we would begin phase 2, which we've been working on, and we've had several meetings to date, as we know. Back last year in September, staff presented an update to the phase 2 draft batch plant interactive map, where we mapped out the batch plants and put some distances in and did some analysis like that. So we presented that back then. Then we went back to ZOAC December 13th last year, and we started to present some strategies for phase 2. And at the beginning, ZOAC asked staff to engage with the industry again. Of course, we had several times in public meetings, but we were to consider a tour. We were looking at a potential bus tour. And then we were going to, of course, return back to you with some clarification. So we've approached the industry. We've had some conversations with them. Unfortunately, we weren't able to put a bus tour together due to, some constraints with the industry as far as legalities and things like that. So they are working on putting together maybe a video for you at some point, not necessarily to be presented in a meeting, but when they send us that link showing some of their operations, we'll just forward it to the committee. So we won't have to wait for another meeting, whenever it's ready, just forward it on. So that's where we are now. Delays on the advance slides. Just give it a minute. Okay. So, just to bring it all back, and for those that might even be just jumping in now to this code amendment, our purpose when we started again was so that we could support CCAP, or the Comprehensive Environmental and Climate Action Plan, which has a goal to ensure that new industries are an appropriate distance away from neighborhoods. And again, the purpose is to protect the sensitive land uses, meaning residential, public parks, parkland, and schools. Another goal is to improve the public health and air quality and provide appropriate locations for the batch plant operations. Because again, we recognize this is a necessary industry. We have construction and we have those needs to have concrete and or asphalt poured for streets and sidewalks and those type of improvements.
While we're waiting for our technology to advance, I will announce that Mr. McGregor joined us at 9:03 a.m. and Ms. Bagley at 9:06 a.m. And I believe I saw Commissioner Popkin joined online at 9:07. Thank you all for being here. And hopefully that was enough of a, not quite, technology.
Let me try it a different way. Okay, that works better. Okay, so some of the actions that have already been taken, and again, I've already mentioned that we had the two-phase approach, and we did it that way because we were trying to address the urgency of the sensitive land uses, and we knew that phase two would take, for a much more comprehensive approach, would take much longer. So again, phase one, the short-term approach, was approved May 11th, 2022. That took and it went ahead and addressed the lack of a public hearing process, and staff did remove at that time the administrative by right approval process and added the specific use permit, which is a zoning process basically requiring the public hearings at City Plan Commission and City Council, and that was for all batch plans. Okay, phase two. So how did we get where we are right now, phase two? Again, it's a very comprehensive review, and stakeholder meetings were held. We had a series of those meetings in English and Spanish with the public, and I didn't put all that information in here again because it's a lot of information. It's in your report, but we met at least 3 times. Online with those meetings. We had industry and professional organizational input meetings as well. And then, of course, still ongoing, but we've held a lot of interdepartmental coordination meetings, various internal staff departments involved, we have a draft internal checklist that I'm saying is our checks and balances. We'll go over that later in the presentation. But and that will not be codified. The purpose of that is an internal process again, and for application intake with the SUPs or at final final CO if we go with the by right approach. So what's next, or what's now? Staff has 3 options for ZOAC to choose so that staff can focus on those items and bring back the draft ordinance. We have strategies that we've preliminarily considered, and we want to get your feedback on what your priorities are for those strategies. There are quite a few of them, and it's coming from a culmination of stakeholders, public stakeholders, industry, internal. So it's a lot of collaboration that we've had. So there are a lot of items. A couple of things to remember. The report that we sent out, and even in this presentation, we have an extensive list of possible recommendations. And they're not intended to represent our ultimate recommendations, because as you know, whatever we come down to today, whatever the decision is, we still have to vet everything through council, meaning, city attorney's office. We have to, go through again internal processes with other departments. We have to make sure that there's things we can do. There's no conflicts with our other ordinances. There's just a lot of things that go into it. So again, it does illustrate in-depth consideration of the issues with other departments and stakeholders. So we may adjust, we may omit, we may expand some of the strategies again, but we want to hone in on what you think is very important for us to do that. So the options. Option one is keep phase one without amendments. That requires all batch plans to obtain an SUP without any of the proposed or modified phase two requirements. Again, that's already in place. We know that. So, and again, that's not allowing any by right. That's all permanent, what we're calling permanent. It's no permanent really, but the batch plans and the temporary batch plans would all be required to go through that SUP process. Pros and cons. Of course, they all have pros and cons. So for option one of the pros, all batch plans must have the public hearing. So we have the public process through the SUP. The ordinance is in effect, like we said. CPC and city council can specify standards on a case-by-case basis. We would have records because anytime you have an SUP, of course, you have a zoning record. So, you can pretty easily track what happened. Staff, current planning keeps those records. Internal processes improved with checks and balances in place. And you're going to see that's pretty much the same for all three options, because we do intend to have the internal checklist with the affidavit at zoning intake and final CO with any three of the options. And again, the affidavit with applicant's signature for accuracy of distances and other requirements. So what are the cons? Because the SUP process is something that an applicant has to go through the public hearings and has to receive approval, unanimous approval from the council, ultimately, there's not as much predictability for the applicants, right? I mean, they don't know until they go through the process. So that's something to think about. The set of required standards are not specified in the ordinance and may be applied without uniformity. So again, CPC and council has authority to put conditions on every SUP. I know y'all know that, but I'm just kind of bringing that up again. So, they may not be quite as uniform, right, if they're on a case-by-case basis. And then, of course, it lengthens the development process potentially because SUPs are required even for temporary batch plans, which may also serve our public projects. As we know, our SUP processes can be a little time-consuming, a little lengthy. So just some things to consider. And I don't know if you want to stop me and ask me questions or if you want to get through it or.
Maybe try to go through all of it and then we can circle back and maybe go through the individual items when there's questions.
Thank you. Okay, so option two is kind of a hybrid. It's keep phase one in place that requires all batch plans to obtain an SUP with some of the proposed or modified phase two standards. And again, what are those? We'll get to those after, but we've been talking about those the last couple of meetings and reports. A little bit has changed, but you have seen them before. What are the pros? What are the cons? Well, some of the same pros. Again, all batch plans must have the public hearings, so you have the public process through the SUP. The zoning portion of the ordinance is already in effect, so, that's kind of a known already. Consistent set of standards, if we actually put some of them into the ordinance, you would have those. Now, you'd still, of course, have some unknowns, because of course it would still be at the discretion of CPC and council to add conditions, right, through an SUP. So, but you might have some, at least you'll have some consistent standards. And then again, internal processes improve with checks and balances in place in the affidavit, still part of phase 2. I'm sorry, option 2. What are the cons? Pretty much the same thing. Less predictability for the applicants due to SUP process, lengthening their time potentially. And staff would need at least a few months to bring back a new ordinance. That'll take some time to get through.
Just a question on this second option. So,
Mr. McGregor, sorry.
thank you, thank you. And thank you, by the way, I'll just say it now, tons of work has gone into this, and I really appreciate a very well written report. Makes our job and everybody's job easier, so thanks for that. In one of the comments from industry about phase 1 is that it's onerous, especially onerous on the temporary batch plant situations. In your option number 2, is there, I could go through all the language, but is there something that specifically addresses that?
We're gonna see that in a minute in option 3.
Okay, okay.
And again, keep in mind, these are 3 options laid out. That doesn't mean that even one option that you might want to keep, well, option 1's kind of what it is. But option, 2 and 3, it doesn't mean, you can tweak it as you see fit. I would say go with the option you feel is the best and most appropriate, that you want us to focus on.
Okay, thank you.
So option 3 would cover all or most of the strategies of phase 2, and also allows the by right temporary batch plants under ideal circumstances. And you've seen that, in several meetings as well, where we, there are some additional land use categories, and several of them for the temporary batch plants. So pros for option number 3, a more flexible and balanced approach that provides more predictability for applicants. Of course, not complete. You're never going to have 100% predictability, because you'd still have some batch plants that have to go through the SUP process. And, so you can't have 100%, but it is a little more flexible and balanced. A more streamlined development process for temporary batch plants that are on site only, and some public projects off site without the need for an FUP. So you'd have a consistent set of development standards. And again, that wouldn't, of course, include any additional that could be added as of the SUP process, anything that required an SUP. And then, of course, some records of batch plants, SUPs only, would be easily tracked through the zoning case. And that's not to say that you're not going to be able to track any records, because you could. It's just that, if it's by right, that's more going through permitting, right? That process. And so their records would be there. And of course, we're planning to have the map, and hopefully everything's going to come together at some point when the city has more data sharing, right? But anyway, I thought I would just bring that up. You would still have the SUP part that would be tracked easily. What are the cons? Well, some of the temporary batch plants that are on site would have much lesser distance requirements than temporary off-site and permanent batch plants. Because again, the whole purpose of a temporary batch plant is to serve a particular project, pour the concrete for their sidewalks, their infrastructure, and then leave. That's the way it's supposed to work, right? They're supposed to be gone. So, having said that, we don't have those greater distance requirements if it's gonna serve an on-site project. It needs to be, on that
On-site?
site, right? So, yes, thank you. Some temporary batch plants on-site would be allowed in residential districts if the temporary batch plant is serving a residential development. That's only. If it's serving a residential subdivision, then it's gonna be in a residential district, so. Staff would need at least a few months longer than option 2 to bring back a new ordinance. Again, there's quite a bit to it, and like we explained earlier, it's, it has to be vetted out completely. Proposed suggestions for standards, and these are options 2 and 3 again. Overview of strategies that may be included, and again, you've seen a lot of these before, but revised categories of land uses and definitions, distances from some or all of other batch plans, residential uses, residential districts, public and or private schools, public parkland, and areas within a floodplain. So those are the distances. Criteria for CPC and city council to approve the SUPs, whether it be a first-time SUP or an SUP at renewal. Revised standards based on best management practices for stormwater runoff, pollutants, and emissions. Standardized signs with pertinent information at the site, the batch plant sites. Additional application information, which is, again, that internal checklist, that application intake and final CO that we're talking about that will not be codified. Additional notification requirements, ingress, egress, and operational plans, landscaping and screening, site requirements, site restoration and remediation. And we'll go through the actual details. I don't know, did you want me to continue? I'm gonna go pretty quickly because we've seen them before.
Is this, I'm gonna generally
lot.
say, well, it's kind of page 12 onward in our report, is that correct?
I'm sorry.
Page 12 and onward in our case report that we all have, where it
Yeah,
talks
the
about
chart.
the options. Yeah,
Yes,
so
thank you.
do we want to hear a summary of this, or do we want to start opening it up for questions?
I'd personally like to ask a question or two before we go further.
Okay, so I think we're going to pause and start, I think, asking some of the questions I think some of us have gathered through listening through the options 1, 2, and 3, and then you can go, about to get to that, and then if we need to go through the rest of the briefing, we can do that. I do want to also acknowledge that Commissioner Carpenter has joined us. Thank you for being with us this morning. And with that, I'll open it up for questions. Mr. Hall.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. On the affidavits regarding the distance, does that require any kind of certified study, survey report, engineering report, or anything, or is it just a document that says I certify that we're X feet from?
Thank you for that. Since we will get to that toward the end, so I'll answer that now, though. Yes, it will require a survey and like a site plan or something with it. But of course, it'll have to be notarized and documented that any distances that the applicant is providing, if it's not accurate, the SUP could be revoked. And that's kind of typical affidavit language from the alcohol distances. Honestly, it was kind of taken from that and modified so that we could use that.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Berger.
I want to pick up on something you said earlier about, with regards to giving by right permission to temporary batch plants, and having a limitation around residential areas. What would happen in the case of some of the projects going on downtown? For instance, there's that this Hunt Holdings project where they tear down the townhouses and they're going to build a variety of uses, and it's around residential and park areas. Would they not be allowed to have a temporary batch plant, or because they're around residential, or how? I mean, that's more nuanced than just in general saying.
Okay. The idea of the by right on site is if it's a mixed-use project or something other than residential, then as long as they meet the requirements, which we'll get to that, but it's basically 330 feet, okay, from the sensitive uses. So that would be a building in use as a residence, or a residential adjacent district, or a public, way we have now, right? A public school or a private school
Right.
or parkland. Okay, so
So you could probably pull it off if they put the plan in the middle, in the center of the property, right? And then they stay away from it.
yes, and honestly, you know, how did we come up with the 330 feet? Well, it kind of started a different measurement. Yeah, well, no, no,
I know.
right. It's coming from a residential adjacency distance that's kind of planted in our mind, right? That's kind of appropriate for a distance from residential. But you're absolutely right. We're giving them some leverage, if you will, for a bigger property to be able to locate interior, especially, let's say it's a residential subdivision. They should easily be able to meet those requirements, right? Because they could locate appropriately within that site. And that's what we want them to do. We want them not to locate, you know, closer to the neighbors, or let's say, you know, if it's a residential subdivision, let's say there's going to be residential more than likely adjacent to it. So we want them to keep as far away as possible.
Okay.
So yes, thank you for the question.
It does.
Good question.
Okay. Any questions from our members online? I think Ms. Levy's gonna continue with our briefing. Oh, and I think we've got one from Vice Chair Blair. Vice Chair Blair.
When we talk about the by right, and usually they are in like residential areas because they're putting down infrastructure in order to do that build. Does this process that we're discussing have provisions that wants to verify that by right development of batch plants are removed at the end of the process?
Yes, and thank you very much for that question. We'll get to that as well in the standards. We have some site remediation and restoration, and that's part of it too. They are to vacate that property when it's completed within 72 hours. They are to inform, I want to say, remember the internal department now, we'll get to that in a minute, but I think it's OEQS. They're to notify them within 72 hours of intent to leave, basically vacate, and then there's measures in place to make sure that that site is left in a proper condition and that remediation occurs.
So you are saying that in this process, that in these three options, if by right is provided, there's also processes in place to make sure that at the end of the process, total remediation is done and the land is left intact, or brought back to its proper use?
Yes, yes, thank you. And just to clarify, the by right option is only part of option 3 right now.
Right, I got it.
Okay.
And I'm on, and I thank you for making sure that we all understand that by right is only option 3, not an option, any other option that's available or that you're proposing.
Right. Thank you, yes.
Okay. Any other questions online? We've got one more question here at the floor.
Yes, Madam Chair.
No hands and I hear no voices.
Mr. Rivas has his hand up.
Mr. Reeves?
If it's been said, I've missed it, and I apologize, but how many SUPs have gone through CPC in the last, 11 months since we did phase 1?
None. There's one that was up for renewal.
Yes, it's in these things.
Yeah, I wasn't gonna say which one, but yes. And it's still pending. It hasn't been brought forward yet. I think they're working with the applicant, but just one that was up for renewal.
Okay, so did that answer your question, Mr. Reeves?
Yes, and is that because we just don't have any, or they're non-conforming and they don't have to get a SUP?
Oh, no,
Non-conforming.
the one that's pending was up, that was expiring. It was just expiring. It had nothing to do with phase 1 or 2. They were just expiring, and I can't remember now the time. It was in 2022, June maybe.
But what's holding it up is some technical right-of-way issues because of some road construction that's taken place on Denton Drive. So it's really not anything to do with in the batch plan. It's just that it's the same thing that any issue.
Thank you.
So-
And that's a permanent plant that's been around for a while. Anyway.
Okay, so if there were no new applications for a temporary batch plant, how many SUPs do you estimate in the next year would have to occur because something expired or they needed to do one? If there were no new ones?
I'm not sure I completely heard, but what I can tell you is.
I mean, my point is, we've been doing this almost a year and we've only have one. So that seems to push like, oh, wow, let's just SUP, and it could, because it's not even one yet in a year. But if we're gonna have 20 in the next year, okay, that's a different point. So you see where I'm just like, everybody's gonna complain about an SUP for the most part, but 100 SUPs shouts louder than one. So that's kind of where I'm going.
Yeah, there's, what I can tell you is that I don't know. I mean, I can't answer, why haven't any more come forward. I mean, I don't know, but what I can tell you is that there's 2 that we know of that are on auto renewal or eligible. Let me just say eligible for auto renewal. They're not. That's never a given, right? But there's 2 of them. One is expiring in June of this year. That hit, with an SUP, and then there's one won't expire till 2037. So I know those are coming up. And those are the only 2 that I know of that have the auto renewals left, honestly. That I'm aware of.
Do we know, and I know staff has been digging into the number, how many batch plants we have today?
Okay, operational, it looks like, to the best of our ability, we have 21. Because, a couple have gone and some of them have become operational that, in this time period.
And does that include temporary and I'm gonna
Yes.
call permanent?
Yes,
Okay, so that's both together, it's total of 20.
it's all operational.
Okay, thank you.
So how many of those 21, how many are permanent and how many are temporary?
I don't have, honestly, I apologize because I don't have the breakdown now I had it, of the permanent and the temporary. Most of these though are permanent, I can tell you that.
Okay.
There's very few that are temporary.
So I think Commissioner Carper,
Yeah,
did you have a question?
most of them are permanent.
And most are permanent. We do have one permanent that's classed as temporary.
I'm sorry.
We do have one permanent plant that's classed as a temporary.
Yes,
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 that's the only one I know of. But,
Right,
yeah,
and-
the vast majority are permanent.
right. Yeah, and,
Is that a number you could just get for us maybe, or?
oh, yes, yes.
Administrative.
And I was hoping we would have the updated map and everything. I've got, in the presentation, I have a map of, from the last meeting that we went through really quickly, and it's been updated now, but I heard, but unfortunately I don't have it. So, you know, it just, yesterday it just wasn't meant to be.
Okay,
But,
so I think.
but I can show you, some things, and I don't know if you want me to fast forward now, or if you want to wait.
Well, I think we've got a few more questions and then maybe we can just continue with the briefing and things we've covered.
Okay.
Thank you. Commissioner Carpenter?
I have one question about option 3, about allowing some temporary by right under ideal conditions. Can you kind of describe ideal a little bit?
Right.
I've never seen ideal conditions, but.
Right. Ideal circumstances are going to be if they meet all the requirements, and that's what we come out with, right? That's all, as many of the protections we feel are necessary, to protect those sensitive uses, right? And enough, a tight enough process to make sure that we don't repeat historical problems like, a permanent plan or a temporary plan under the guise of a permanent plan, just, COs that aren't valid, just, we want to tighten up the process. We want to make sure that all the protections are in place, but that we also are recognizing that at the end of the day, we need the industries and, we're not trying to overburden, and stop construction basically.
Would that primarily be distancing and buffering?
It will. It's all the measures that we'll go through. And I say all, it's whatever you want us to focus on, basically.
So, and Vice Chair Blair and then Mr. Hall.
Couple things. Automatic auto renewals. Is there an option or a process or have you considered rethinking automatic renewals and time limits on automatic renewals since we're now opening the code for batch plans and rewriting it?
Thank you for the question. Couple of things about the auto renewals, and we'll get to that too. So the renewal, we can call it auto renewal. It's really not auto, right? Because it's still something at the end of the day that has to either be approved or not by CPC and council.
No.
So you
no,
would
no,
come with,
no.
You can wait. So,
Well, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Miss
Yeah.
May, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think she just.
I did.
She just.
So
Thank you.
if they meet the criteria that's in the SUP process that says they're eligible for renewal, right?
Still have to apply.
Yeah, then they have to apply within that 6-month time period before they expire. So then they can be approved, right? I mean, they can get X amount of additional time. We have looked at that. That process is already in our code in another place. It's under the SUPs. That may be something we may want to consider also for the future. But so to answer your question, renewals, we have it differently for the by right process or the temporary batch plants. The renewal is they have 2 opportunities, 6 months at the most, right? But they have to show their construction contract. So it's either less than that or it's more. And then once they exceed that, that's it. They have to then get an SUP if there's, any further delays. They're going to have to go through the process. For the permanent plants, what we're calling permanent plants, what we're saying is it is performance-based, the renewals, and they could, if they have no history of noncompliance or, now it's working. If there's no history of violations, then we're recommending that they may be able to get 5 years if it's first time. If it's first time, they're not going to have a history of violation. So 5 years first time maybe, and then that should have been changed. It wasn't.
Okay,
But
so,
and performance based is how we had it, or we could leave it no renewals unless specified in the SUP approval.
so basically what you're saying is in the autumn renewal process, there has been, you guys, staff has reviewed the process and has made, and will be making recommendations based on your review of what is already in code to make a presentation to ZOAC as to what to do with the auto renewal process.
Can I jump in?
Sure.
And I would say, like, also our discussion on the staff level has been, is it appropriate to redefine the auto renewal process just for concrete batch plants? Or is it more appropriate to look at it as a process in general?
Can we make a recommendation to you guys when it comes down to that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you could definitely, we would love to hear your input and feedback on everything that's discussed. I think, like, as a professional opinion though, I think right now it's probably best to consider the process of auto renewals generally, like in a separate discussion.
Well, and I beg to differ with that. And I'm sure there are some commissioners that are present that will beg to differ with that as well. Especially when there is, under certain circumstances, the push to make auto renewals under the SUP process permanent based on the land use. So based on the land use and the process that we're using SUPs for in this particular scenario, I would say emphatically that I believe it would be appropriate that based on if it's a SUP process for alcohol, SUP process for schools, they're far more friendlier than the SUP process for batch plants, and they should not all be treated the same. So based on that belief system, I am going to recommend that under batch plants and the use of the SUP process, that staff looks at it strictly for batch plants and come back with a recommendation. I would also ask that one of the groups that I see is missing in this discussion is code.
They're online.
They're online? Okay, good. Okay. So, and your code? Oh, and especially environmental code, they're online. Good. Because they too must have a total agreement and a total appreciation to what we're handing off to them, so that they can come back and join the conversation, whether it's something they have, first of all, they have staff to adhere to, and two, if we are given off something that is not conducive to the way that they do business. And I think that's all I have for right now.
Mr. Hall, and then I think we may try to go ahead and wrap up the briefing, because I think there's gonna be a lot more discussion and comments.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the map that you guys handed out back in February last year. And I had circled 20 batch plants in District 6. Is that right?
No.
At one time, that map showed any batch plant that ever existed. Those don't exist anymore. There's only one.
There's only one.
And not well in West Dallas, there are a lot in the upper northeast part of it. Now, where they're crossing all of that. Yeah.
Okay.
And how many-
Mr. Hall, for clarification, is that a staff generated map or the industry?
I guess it's staff.
Yeah, it was in one of our case reports. I think it was an early map that was in process with GIS when you guys were trying to track it down. And so, and just for the record, Ms. Levy, can you, I guess you would need to see the map to refresh your memory, but I think what I heard Commissioner Carpenter, you said this we think was capturing everything that existed at one time that may not.
Oh, this one.
Yeah.
Stayed
Oh,
on
yeah.
in the database until they got someplace and something else. Now they're removing them if they expire.
Yeah, that was historic.
So
We had
we have
all batch plans at one time historically, because we wanted to, you know.
show where they had occurred.
Right, but operational, we now have, we know what we have operationally, and that's 21, and I can.
Do we think we have a map in our briefing today? You said it was in process.
I put them in the back in case y'all wanted to see them. It's not complete, these are not completely edited, but it's the ones we had in December.
Can you
It's
show
very
it?
close. I can.
So I guess what I was curious is, you mentioned 21. And looking back at this map, I thought they're all in one district, concentrated. But 21 are spread out
Oh,
in industrial-based zoning throughout the city.
yes, now,
Can you go to the map?
oh, I did, that's a delay.
Can you enlarge that just a little bit?
8.
6 and 8.
Unfortunately, it's not going to.
So
They're
Mr.
not-
Hall, I know it's small, but those are the dots.
Yeah, I don't have a. You know, you have to get on the interactive map to zoom into each little section, but
No, that's fine, but
if you, as you can see, and we know, a lot of the batch plants are, in heavily
district.
in 2 districts,
So
so things
just call it what it is, 6 and
Yeah.
8.
6 and 8.
Mhm.
So most of the 21 are
No.
6.
Now, let me show you probably, one reason why. A lot of the industrial zoning, the purple, the lavender, if you will, is IR, and then the red is IM zoning.
I need to go look at that.
Can we pause for a minute to give everybody a frame of reference?
I get
So sort of the lower, kind of going up to the left-hand side, is that I-35? I don't know if you can use your cursor to highlight where that is. I think the
Yes.
void is University Park and Island Park.
I mean, it's a
It's that
static.
lighter color, just to give you an orientation. So this is predominantly.
This is the tollway.
I have a blow up on the next frame.
This is Loop 12. This is LBJ. So this,
There's a blow up of it.
Okay,
It's
is
Foxman Lake down at the bottom.
LBJ,
That's Baldwin Lake?
yeah.
Okay, got it.
I moved the map.
So
Northwest Highway's going.
does that give you the context?
Yeah, no, that's perfect. So,
But that's, okay, do you have one for District 8 as well?
Let me go back. It should show.
Because that's not showing District 8.
Well, do you have an enlarged one for District 8 or just the overall?
No,
map?
this was just to show the IM and IR of the industrial zoning.
But that doesn't include District 8. And District 8 has a large corridor that has nothing but IM and IR. When you go down, straight down 20 and 310.
Yeah, I'm sorry, this isn't the interactive map, so I can't really move around
So-
like, on a static map, but
here, your District 8 is
let me see.
south, far south.
Yeah,
Let me-
far south, quarter parts.
Yes, got it. Okay.
So let me see your map.
Well, can we keep it
Oh,
on
keep
the
it-
screen?
yeah.
So we need it on the screen so that everybody
But
has the
she
same
doesn't-
information.
She can't provide it on the screen. That's not it.
Well, it's not the enlarged map.
I'm
She has
just
the
moving
overall.
maps
Yeah,
because
this is
I
a-
know you want to see
this
8,
is a-
but, they're showing different things. Here it's just showing batch plants closer than 600.
635 is right.
That's 20.
20.
So you could give us the map that shows both where they occur and in an enlarged map on the, is that fair?
Yes, like I said, there was a purpose to,
Yeah,
the map shots that are in here.
no, I understood. And so I think would that be
Right.
helpful for everyone? So
Yes.
we have those maps?
Absolutely.
But we would need to have a map that has all of, have a location of all the batch plants that we are looking at and discussing.
But I think we want them just in terms of their context, is that correct? Distance from sensitive land uses?
Right.
And to
That's-
know what
Well,
we're,
no, we need to know where they are first before we know the distance between sensitive land uses.
well, they're-
So if we have 21 batch plants, I need to see a map where all 21 of those batch plants are.
Right,
And then we need to have an overlay that not only shows where all of them are, the surrounding uses that they're sitting in order to best be able to discuss the appropriateness of the land use for batch plants, whether they be permanent, whether they be temporary, and how we are looking to manage this process for those land uses.
well, now let's remember that for the permanent batch plants, for phase one, they are only allowed by SUP in the IM zoning district, which is why, well, we have the IM and IR here. But, there is no other district that they're allowed to locate in. And so this map shows you what's available as far as the IM zoning in red.
And what I am expressing, and I'm sure Commissioner Carpenter would appreciate this, is just because they're supposed to be there doesn't mean that they are. That we have batch plants that are not where they're supposed to be, and they're existing, and part of the process that we're discussing is how do we manage those batch plants? And whether the options that are available, we can't do a piece of the job, we have to look at the total job.
so Ms. Levy, do you have that within your presentation that talks about, I know within our case report, we have how non-conforming uses will be handled, but or can someone from code maybe speak to existing locations and how those will be evaluated? I think that's what I'm hearing the question is that right?
Yes.
Do you have specific questions about non-conforming?
Oh, absolutely.
Well, just,
So how about we do this for everyone? Did you have other information? Because we're really, I think, getting into discussion of details. Was there other information in your briefing that you want to share with us before we open up some of these specific questions?
well, I did, I mean, you've seen it before, but I did want to go through very quickly the standards, just what's here, but very quickly, but you've seen it in the report, so if you feel that that's not necessary, we can go right into the non-conforming and questions, because maybe that helps, you know. that helps.
So this is kind of the summary of the standards that this body might consider.
More of the details,
Okay,
correct?
so I think before we start really diving into questions, could either you or Ms. May speak to what is the charge that you're looking for from this body today?
We're looking for, what you feel is the best option for staff to focus on and what your priorities are for these standards so that we can focus on those to bring back an ordinance, a draft ordinance.
And I would also, on that note, just to remind everyone, that, what we're looking at as our charge is what is the best situation for this land use, not necessarily what's, going on and how do we, fix these old ones. What should we be doing moving forward? What's the best action to take for, the appropriate land use? Now, we do have non-conforming procedures and code enforcement and community prosecution, and we have OEQ that are here that, if we do have some more procedural questions, we can ask them some of those things. But, for the amendments to chapter 51 and 51A, we're trying to come up with the best plan for how these uses should be regulated.
And one clarification that I want to make sure I heard correctly. So we have three options that are kind of laid out but if we see a piece of option 3 that we want to move into option 2, that's the type of direction in terms of priorities that you're looking for from us?
Absolutely.
Okay. All right. So
Yes.
with that, I think we left the discussion with Vice Chair Blair's question on existing code compliance. You want to talk about that, or
My little dissertation. I don't want this topic of discussion to go to CPC and for CPC to feel we did not do a good job. I don't want the framing of the options to be limited and not have the opportunity for this body to look at batch plants holistically and be able to walk away. I don't want my hands tied behind my back and say, this is all that I can do. I need everybody here to be comfortable that all matters of discussion have been appreciated. With that also being said, I do know that there is an entirely different section that we are not touching, and that's concrete crushing. And I do know that publicly, those that aren't land use knowledgeable, they think it's all one same. And if we don't address something or put parameters around that, we're going to also it's also going to be believed that we did not look at the totality of the charge and come back with a complete answer. So somewhere there needs to be a conversation that says we have addressed, or if we're not going to address, what we need to do in order to make the community as a whole know that we've done the total job. So that's all I have to say at this time, but I'm sure that I will come up with something else in another minute or two.
Did we just lose City Hall?
I was just wondering the same thing, thinking it was my internet.
Or
I guess we have.
Commissioner Blair just dropped the mic and the meeting was over?
Quite possible.
Yeah, I mean, that was a good timing for it, just like, ooh.
Oh, shoot. That dropped him off. Goodness.
Well,
it is 10:01. We're gonna pause.
Oh, there they are.
And they're back. So that was a
You-
30-second pause. Remember that
Take a
fast.
5-minute break.
Yeah.
What did we miss?
Nothing, that you guys were gorgeous people.
I know. So just to state for the record, for those who are online, it was discussion on the maps and the maps that will be distributed to us. They're going to be PDFs that staff is going to prepare and circulate.
We thought there was an epic mic drop after Commissioner Blair spoke. Pretty great timing. We thought there was an epic mic drop after Commissioner Blair spoke, so it's pretty great timing.
We thought, boom, meeting over.
So,
Go through the non-conforming, so that maybe, we have other staff here that I don't know how long they can stay.
well, I guess, and can we go over what other staff is here in case there's questions for them? So I think I heard we had co-compliance.
In compliance, we have,
Landscape, Phil
uh,
Arbors.
we have Phil Irwin, our arborist, chief arborist, and, we have, some staff from Harley Q over here. What else?
And we talk about environmental performance, if we needed that.
Right. And those are kind of the departmental special guests, I guess.
So members online, we had the one question here about maps. Do you all have questions for any of that staff or any staff really? Mr. Reeves.
Yes, so a question about maps. Would it be possible to have, if there's 21 batch plants, to have them in an Excel spreadsheet where they're all going down column A, and then column B is distance from residential. Column C is distance from a sensitive area. Column D is distance from a park. So that we can see what's out there and actually see those criteria, and then and what zoning they're currently in and what's their current status, where are they operating, so that we can just see the totality of this, because maybe someone's 300 feet from a residential area where we want 330. Maybe someone's 1,000 feet, but they have, they miss this. I'll kind of go back to the question of, do we want door number 1, door number 2, or door number 3? I think in the perfect world, we want door number 3, option number 3 here, because that's a little bit more concrete. Bad pun, not intended. But if we can kind of slice and dice and see the totality of this, then that kind of helps me get my head around, does that lead to more option number 1 or number 2, or does that give us a path to option number 3? I really think I need the data. And if it was in kind of a chart where we could look at this, you could slice this and say, okay, if we did 330 feet from residential, and if we did 1,000 feet from here, then this one violates, but these 16 are okay. I just, again, not knowing where all these things are, I don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater here. But yet I am so, sensitive to somebody that's living right beside one of these things with the noise and the rocks and the pollution and whatnot. So that's what I would like to see, long story short.
And we do have that. It needs to be a little updated, and I guess I took them out of the presentation because the addresses were there. So we need to take the addresses away. But, and I can tell you the numbers just for now, though. For the distances, there's approximately three that do not meet the 1,640-foot distance from the nearest residential district out of that 21. And they're less than 1,000 feet. And then distance from another batch plant, that the 1,640 feet, there's approximately 7 that do not meet that, and some of them that as close as 50 feet or adjacent. So there's no amount of distance that's going to solve that.
I think Ms. Gillis may have a.
Hi. Go ahead.
I think we just talked. I don't know.
Okay,
if we
it's
need-
top. I don't know.
Okay, who doesn't know my, Andrea Gillis, Assistant Director of Planning and Urban Design. I just wanted,
Could you hit the button? I think that's.
No, she's on. She's on.
There's no button.
She's on.
What's the feedback that I'm hearing?
The
I think
AC.
it's the
AC.
Yeah.
Okay.
And maybe
Yeah.
electrocuted.
Yeah,
No,
yeah, just talk.
Okay, so, I just wanted to, I've sort of been gathering the discussion, and one thing and I think Sarah touched on this a little bit. I just want to be clear that we're not trying to fix the situation of the existing. I mean, there's a piece of this, but we are not trying to fix the situation or come up with a plan for the existing batch plans. What we need to do is establish code moving forward. Because even if we say, okay, now this batch plant is within 300 feet, so now it's theoretically non-conforming, that doesn't mean it goes away. It's there, if it's legally non-conforming, it can continue to function. What we need to figure out is, thinking in our minds, if a new batch plant is going to go in tomorrow, what are the standards that we want for that new batch plant? I feel like a lot of this discussion is centering around trying to solve what's going on with the existing batch plants. And yes, that's part of it. If there's code that we need to address, if there is a problematic batch plant, we're moving forward. But some of the solutions to that are going to be enforcement, separate code apart from zoning, a whole laundry list of things. So I just want to make sure that we're not trying to solve for the ones on the ground today. And we need to think about a code moving forward and any amendments that are necessary for one that may come into the city tomorrow and apply for a certificate of occupancy.
Matt, may I ask a question then? Okay, and I think Mr. Reeves may be asking the same one, so I'll let him go. Mr. Reeves.
Okay, as a student of history, if you don't know the history, it's bound to repeat itself. So what I would like to see is the history of what we have on the ground now, because maybe one or two or three of those do not fit, but nobody has a problem with them. So that would point to me, okay, we could lower that standard, like from 330 to 300 or 330 to maybe we need to go to 400. You can say, well, no, that's too close, because we can at least see what we have now and analyze it and see, okay, what is the issue with this one or this one or this one, or the big picture, because that helps us craft stuff for the future. I totally agree. We're looking at the future, but if we don't know the past, it's going to repeat itself potentially. That's the reason I want to see what's on the ground.
Yeah, and I think having that data is important. I just want to make sure there's been quite a bit of very detailed conversation about what's going on in individual plants, and it feels like we're trying to resolve some of those. So I want to manage expectations and not move into the fact that changing the standards here is going to resolve the issues for the existing ones. We may need to.
I totally agree, and I appreciate that statement for sure. But like I said, it's if we come up with something like, oh, look, this batch plant meets all that criteria, and then Commissioner Carpenter, drags me by the ear to her district and says, look at this. No, shouldn't do this right here. And here's why. I'll be, okay, then we need to potentially adjust that for the future. Not that Commissioner Carpenter would grab anybody by the ear and drag them out there, but. Yes.
Thank you, Ms. Gillis. All right, so we do have 2 registered speakers, but I do want to make sure that we've all asked questions and given direction to staff as a part of today's meeting.
We'll come back with that. We'll come back to us later, right, after we get input from.
I think
As
we're
far as-
looking to get all the part.
Oh, really?
Well, just whatever questions we want to get out, because that may inform what you want to speak to as well.
Okay, so I was,
Yeah.
so thank you for that. I think, I have 2 of them. One of them is a question and one of them is a sort of asking for you guys to think about something. The first one is, do any of the options change the requirements for permanent batching? Is the items that you list here, are they different than what permanent batch plants have?
Are they different from?
Yeah,
Today.
so do options
Today.
1, 2, or
Oh,
3,
yes.
do they substantially change or change in any way current requirements for plants, they do.
Oh, yeah,
Okay, and that's-
absolutely.
Okay.
Because right now, it's whatever's in an SUP ordinance. And then, because we have phase one, right? Everything's by SUP. So
Okay.
it's whatever is put into the
I see.
SUP ordinance.
I see, and that's where the,
And there's not distance requirements or anything like that, right?
Okay. excellent.
And I would also mention that, with phase one, it required, it made concrete batching, asphalt and concrete batching a potentially incompatible use. And whenever something's a potentially incompatible use, it has to not only be in, not only get an SUP, but be in the IM zoning district. So before phase one, concrete batch plants were allowed in the IR zoning district with an SUP and were allowed by right in IM.
Okay.
And so that's a major change that happened in phase one.
For the permanent, right?
Thank you. And then I do have a second one, and this one is really the request I have of staff. I gather from conversation we had that part of the reason why we see dumping of plants in District 6 and 8 is because of the existing land use and where plants can go. I would like to see from staff a thought-out process or proposal, or call it where you want, long-term strategy to prevent that continued dumping of batches in those. Paying attention. That makes sense. It needs to be said, and it's not fair to dump over.
Commissioner Carpenter?
I do have an environmental question. This is the time to ask it while the staff is here, because I saw in the report that one of the recommendations was not to allow these plants within 100 feet of a floodplain. And most of the time at CPC, we're told to ignore floodplain status because anything can potentially be taken out of the floodplain. But I know it's also been an issue. Well, if you look up at the northwest part of District 6, Ryan, Luna, Spangler, California Crossing, where a lot of these are clustered, virtually all of it's in a floodplain. So I'm a little confused about how that standard could be applied in this situation, especially when we consider that the clustering of IM zoning tends to be either in or relatively close to floodplain.
Again, this is going forward, so it's just a recommendation of a distance that they be at least 100 feet from it.
I guess that's my question. Is that even possible, considering where IM zoning is located?
Well, they have an out. They have the SUP process that they can go through, to ask for that. But we're asking to protect our floodplain and just step away from it 100 feet. We're not,
Oh, I understand the
Yeah.
desirability of it. It's the applicability of it, if it's
Right.
even theoretically possible. Is anybody here from OCEQ?
I'm sorry, what is it? Oh, I missed the question, I'm sorry.
About
She's asking.
about the enforceability or the desirability, or how would a recommendation to not situate a batch plant within 100 feet of a floodplain play out in reality in the city, given where IM zoning is located?
About air enforcement?
No,
Yeah.
it would be in the floodplain ordinance, and it is wholly consistent with that floodplain ordinance that is by the Federal Emergency Management Administration guidance
I guess
for floodplain management.
I guess my question then is, because a great many of these current plants, and I'm sorry, I'm talking about current conditions, but it's going to be future also, depending on, considering where the IM zoning is, this land is in a floodplain. So if there are current standards now that don't advise that these kinds of facilities don't go in a floodplain, how are we ending up with these plants clustered in a floodplain?
I can't answer that. So we
Yeah.
have requirements for doing both floodplain changes and also fill in a floodplain. And theoretically, when you're doing any kind of a structure in an area that is designated as a floodplain, you need to adhere to those rules. And they do have 10 engineering guidance. They typically require engineering analyses, like hydrologic and hydraulic analyses, that it's not gonna cause flooding. Not all of the facilities that I know of have maybe gone through that process. And I know there's some on the airport that may not have all the permits they're supposed to have.
And that's not really our process, that's,
No, it's in the floodplain management group that is in DWU now. I know, because I used to do that.
If I may, can y'all please state your name for the record?
I'm sorry, Susan Alvarez, I'm the Assistant Director for the Office of Environmental Quality, and this is Carlos Evans,
Carlos
the
Evans,
Director.
the Director, Office of Environmental Quality and Sustainability.
Thank you both for being here. And Ms. Gillis, I think you have a
And-
follow-up.
And just one final on that, we actually had this discussion. We were talking about the authorized hearing in the Floral Farms area recently. Given the size of some of these properties, it's much easier when you've got a floodplain issue. Given the size of some of these properties, it's much easier to move some of these things around to do the mitigation that needs to occur to get these permits through. So I think a lot of these are on very large properties where you have options to move certain things around.
And so follow-up related to that, does that mean, and I think we've got one of our conditions in here is the size of the property? Does that mean that that should be then a consideration? And is that then a consideration specifically tied to locations in a floodplain? Because it's a distance requirement, but then there's a site requirement. So how do those two work together?
Well, right now we just have a minimum of 1 acre. Now, we know that a lot of the facilities like the permanent are gonna be much larger. But that's probably more for the temporary, right? You've gotta have a minimum because they have to meet all of the other requirements for development, right? They have to meet setbacks. In this case, they have distance requirements from their equipment to the property line, and that's TCEQ's, requirements to a large degree. We're including that they abide by those requirements as well. So you've got, it's just like any other site where even if you have a minimum size, that doesn't mean that they can just, like in this case, they may not be able to still do an acre site, right? They may not be able to develop on an acre site if they can't meet all the other parameters. Setbacks, distance from a floodplain, distance requirements from, residential and all the adjacent. They have to meet all the requirements, just like any development. It's not just one ordinance, there's layers and they've got to meet all of them. And whatever it takes, to meet all of the requirements is what they'll have to do.
So I have another cue, but did you have another question? So related to that, I saw that we have recommendations on potential landscaping, sort of air quality treatment through our buffers, through our tree plantings. Has there been any similar consideration of doing stormwater treatment? My terminology is failing me at the moment, but essentially when we're having runoff, treating that on site similar to how we're talking about air quality. Is that I didn't see any of that contemplated in this, but is that anything that should be considered?
Oh, it is. It's under, I'm sorry, but it's under the BMPs, basically, dust control, dust management practices, and there's different layers of that. There's some for dust and noise, and then there's more on the stormwater, pollutant water conservation. So there's several under I've kind of grouped them this time to try to help with that, but
well, I guess so I'm on page 15 of our case report. So a lot of this seems to be talking about sound. I see dust control measures, and then it does mention stormwater drainage, but stormwater drainage is per current. I guess I'm asking, is this going far enough? Just like we're talking about additional provisions or landscaping that go beyond what would be standard particle 10.
right.
I know if we look at some of our other industry standards, that there's other on-site water treatment that helps talk about our water quality, similar to how we're talking about our air quality.
Right, now, there is already a lot in the stormwater ordinance. It's a separate chapter in ordinance, I want to say it's 19, I have it
Yes.
listed in the report, but I do have some in here as well. I don't know what page it is, I'm sorry.
Okay, and by the way,
Anyway,
I'm happy to follow up, but that was a
I have it
question I
up on
had.
the screen. Batch plants shall be designed to enable recycled water from the water management system to be used for slumping. Testing reports shall be required to be kept on site for water used for mixing water for concrete. Cleaning of batch plant rubbish on site and off site shall be required immediately upon spillage. Concentration of transport shall be to muck storage areas only. Truck washout shall not be performed in residential neighborhoods. And then there's a whole other list for discharge, prevention, reporting, and cleanup. Those I didn't put in the report. I said it will be in the presentation because there were so many
Okay.
to list, so I'm sorry. They're
No,
up
no,
on
no.
the screen.
That was the question I had.
There's just so many.
Okay.
And I would like to add, you know, best practices in 2023 are vastly different than what we had early, 20th century, where we put all of our industrial uses on the floodplain, So, another thing I wanted to, just encourage us to keep in mind is, a lot of these very detailed and very well-researched best management practices might belong better in like a checklist that staff has on hand that can continually be updated and presented, with the SUP materials and staff recommendation on the SUP applications and things like that. But just, keep that in mind, she's done a lot of work and done a lot of research, but, these things evolve and they get better. And, what we think is, grade A right now might not be so. Yeah.
2 years from now? 5
Yes.
years. I understand.
Yes.
So, other questions? Mr. Reeves?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I had to unmute there. So back to the floodplain issue again. I know that concrete, when it's all together, doesn't cause pollution, but it's all the pieces and parts. It's all the ingredients of concrete that are bad. So are there rules currently, if they are in a floodplain, that they have to store these chemicals where they can't be washed away? If it's the aggregate, it's the gravel, and my property gets flooded, and gravel's fine, it's not gonna hurt it. But if it's the lime or if it's something else that they put in there, and all of a sudden it gets washed downstream, that seems like it would be bad, and we should be ruling again, we should have ordinances against that. But if they were in a floodplain and they were keeping the stuff that could wash and that is toxic up in a tower or something along those lines, then okay, well, you can put the gravel in the floodplain, but anything that's bad has to be up on stilts above the floodplain. I would assume that stuff is regulated, but again, assumptions can get you in trouble.
Oh, I'm sure we have discharge of pollutants. I know we have a lot in ordinance for that, and that may be, I don't know, if someone from OEQS wants to speak on that, but yes, to answer your question, yes, we do have stormwater management type ordinance.
Yeah, we had industrial permits to regulate that.
It's actually state permits as well, stormwater permits.
Yeah, TCQ.
So theoretically, if one of these, I was just looking at the Dallas zoning map and everything up around Luna Road and it's all floodplain. And if we did have a big flood, then theoretically, those people should be operating underneath rules that would not allow toxic waste to come down the Trinity River at that point. Theoretically.
That's correct. Susan Alvarez with the Office of Environmental Quality and Sustainability. All industrial sites in Dallas are required within certain SIP codes are required to obtain a state pollutant discharge elimination system permit for their particular facility. Those permits are inspected and enforced upon as necessary by staff in the Office of Environmental Quality. Those permits do require a whole list of ongoing monitoring of what comes off of that site, and also site controls to prevent both windborne and waterborne contaminants from coming from those sites. I'm happy to provide staff with a copy of that permit if that would be helpful.
So if somebody's in a floodplain versus a site that's not in the floodplain, are the rules different?
Nope. If anything, the more stringent.
And did you hear that, Mr. Reeves?
I didn't yeah, I did, but I didn't understand that. And so if I have a site that is not in the floodplain versus a site that is in the floodplain, the rules are the same?
So you come under additional rules. So if you are in the floodplain, then you come in under the city's floodplain ordinance.
Okay.
And those rules apply in addition to your permit related rules. The permit is provided by the state and enforced by city staff.
Okay, so in theory then, what I'm looking up the screen, no closer than 100 feet from a floodplain or floodway, it should be a non-factor in theory.
Should be, but it's.
I mean, it should, like, if we have rules where the floodplain doesn't matter, then maybe putting all of these in a floodplain is very appropriate, because we're not going to put a house in the floodplain. We're not going to put an apartment. You know, someone's not going to put their commercial retail business in a floodplain because they would be wiped out. But if these guys are following the rules, then potentially, is this a good place for them to be? I'm not saying it is, it's a question.
This is Carlos Evans, the director of OEQS. We can get additional information to you. We can get you the permit, and we can get you the city ordinance if you need additional information to figure out the current status for the current state flood.
Okay, so my point to ZOAC is that third bullet, no closer than 100 feet, you know, could we just strike that? Because it doesn't matter, because everybody's already covered if they're in a floodplain. So like, why is that 100 feet there then? Like suggested, potential.
Protection of the floodplain, basically.
So it's an additional protection, is that what you said, Ms. Levy?
Just to keep away from the floodplain.
And again, I think that will be us to make our determination on that, Mr. Reeves.
Okay, all right, that was my points. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Reeves. Other questions? All right. Then I'm going to pause our discussion, hear from our registered speakers, and then we're going to look for a motion after that.
And we might have some in the audience.
Yes, yeah. I'm sorry, Commissioner Carpenter, did you have a question?
I was going to ask if we were going to run through briefly these
Options?
Yes. Yeah. The different factors that we're supposed to be considering as part of option.
As a part of option 3, you have the factors that are in your, trying to get to the right page on here.
The standardized science certification requirement, landscaping. We could briefly go through those, what the different factors were we should be considering as part of option 3.
She had a slide for that.
Yeah, the slide that you have that talked about what the considerations might be under the option 3 strategy.
Oh, the overview instead of the details.
Yeah, well, because it's essentially,
Trying to advance.
It's for those that are listening.
because we're talking about the distances, the landscaping buffers, screening,
Yeah.
automatic renewals. Yeah.
You want the details?
No, just a high level.
Okay. Advance.
One of the details is.
Basically, okay, so the distances, for the permanent, we're talking about, again, distances from the sensitive land uses, and those would be residential structure, residential district, public and or private school, or public park land. So for permanent, we're talking about greater than or equal to 1,640 feet. That's for asphalt or concrete. If it's an alternative green concrete batch plant, greater than or equal to 1,320 feet. And And then for the temporary, again, if it's on site, 330 feet from those sensitive land uses. And if it's off site, and again, they would need an SUP if they were gonna go off site for a private project, but it would be greater than or equal to 1,640 feet. Distances from other batch plans doesn't apply to put the temporary on site. It does apply for the SUP off-site, same 1,640 feet, and it's the same for the permanent. If it's a regular plan, it's 1,640 feet. If it's in concrete, it's 1,320 feet. There are exceptions that we were asked to look at, and we did look at that. So if a batch plant, permanent batch plant is located greater than or equal to 1,640 feet from a sensitive land use, and they're proposed to be along a freight rail line that they're using for the batching facility, then they may reduce their distance from another batch plant.
What does that mean?
Not a sensitive land use, but from another batch plant to 1,320 feet if it's a regular concrete plant. Measured from nearest point to nearest point. Now that's big because the measurements otherwise is property line to property line. So not only would we be reducing the distance for the exception between batch plant to batch plant, if it's, they're far away from sensitive land uses, it would be point to point with that lesser distance. If it is an alternative grain batch plant, they would be able, and they didn't have a sensitive land use within 1,320 feet from sensitive land use, the same thing, and they were along a freight rail line that they were using for the facility, they may get a reduction for between the batch plants greater than or equal to 1,000 feet measured from point to point. So that's an exception for those. And it's the same for the off-site ones, the temporary off-site. And let me just say that the reason, because that's where they may find a piece of land that may serve more than maybe one facility, so they want to go off-site. They still need an SUP. So that's pretty much the same type of measurements for those. Then we have the site requirements. You know a lot of those. We talked about the minimum size and distance from floodplain. No more than one batch plant on any one building site. Parking, maneuvering, and driveways for the permanent plant. It's must be on a compacted subgrade. It must be concrete or asphalt. No cluster pervious surfaces where there's vehicles being operated. The difference in the temporary on that is that it must be a compacted subgrade and must be dust-proof surface and maintained as such. We don't want them to put down asphalt or concrete for a temporary site, because they're going to lay the permanent infrastructure with development. And it's the same for the landscaping. For a temporary plant, we're not proposing any landscaping at all because you're going to landscape that site for whatever use it's going in. Access, ingress and egress prohibited on residential streets for the permanent plants. And then the only difference between the temporary and the permanent is the temporary, they can have their access off residential streets if it's serving a residential site and the site has no other access. Then the truck routes, we're just getting that per the approved operations plan. We're asking for a lot of information through the operations plan so we can get that laid out. And if it's by right, obviously that's going to be some calls by the director and building official. If it's by SUP, obviously we'll have that information for the SUP. Performance bonds, we're asking for that to help protect that site with video and photos of the entire site documenting existing conditions so that we can make sure that we have these, sites intact when they leave. Site restoration and remediation, again, they're being asked to leave the site, and then get an inspection too before they leave the site. Signs, all signs posted on the property, with name and address, SUP number and expiration, and then, specific signs that are, pretty consistent. And then we have all the BMPs for noise. We have some certain ones for noise in addition to our noise ordinance. Equipment must have the devices to manage the noise. And again, these may be things that maybe we don't put in the ordinance, I don't know. Sound blankets being used, when they're adjacent to residential. A lot of different dust control measures, a lot of those stormwater. Screening for a permanent plant, we're asking for a minimum height of 8 feet solid screening. And then for a temporary, obviously, we don't want them to put up a temporary fence, but some sort of a temporary screening they can use. And then we want it to be opaque though, so they can achieve that with, some sort of a temporary fence along with sound blankets and maybe a combination of landscaping if they want to do that. But they have to achieve the 8 feet in height as well. Then landscaping. And we do have the arborist here, but we have the buffer yards adjacent to streets 30 feet, 20 feet adjacent to all other properties or across an alley. And then, with a series of trees, some of them staggered in a double row every 30 linear feet for the total length of the perimeter. That's in interior and exterior to the screening wall. And then minimum of 18 evergreen trees for every 100 linear feet along the street right of way to provide the continuous screen, or they have some options, of course. They can do the staggered row of the evergreen shrubs, or they can also do a shrub row along the fence. Then there's some other buffer yards as well with some protections there with some trees. And of course, because we can't account for every situation, we've got some alternative buffering, landscaping, and screening so that if there's some easements in the way, water lines, other constraints, or if they would like to utilize, which we would like them to take advantage of some opportunities for green infrastructure, then we have something where they, as long as they achieve minimum or equivalent to what the landscape ordinance is, spirit and intent, then we can work with them through the SUP process for that. Public notification, we did expand that. It would be 500 feet, no matter what size the area is. Right now, the minimum is 200 feet. I know y'all are aware of that, but for sites under 1 acre, and then it steps, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we're going to do 5 no matter what size it is. We talked about the renewals. And then in considering an SUP, just some ideas that maybe the Commission and Council consider whether or not the requirements have been met. Public comments, location of the proposed facility relative to some other uses, not only the sensitive uses, but maybe outdoor sports fields, licensed daycare facilities, public hospitals, places of worship, things like that. That is pretty much it for the standards. There's quite a bit. Again, if there's something you want specifically that you don't like, you want us to strike, or something else that we didn't already think about. Checks and balances, we talked about that. This would not be codified, but there is already a draft of a checklist, getting a lot of information up front from all of these batch facilities, including attachment of their operational plan, the distances from all these uses. Whatever we decide will be the distances and which ones, of course. How many trucks are on site? What type of equipment they have for particulate matter control systems. The number for their TCEQ air permit application. We were gonna get the application, that's kind of a lot of documents. As long as we have the file, we can get to that information, we can check that. And then, again, we have the affidavit as well. We have history of any violations that they have, how was that resolved, the specific information about that. Final on-site inspection, they have to check off that they've met everything that we're asking for, including the distances for TCEQ on-site requirements. That's just a draft of the affidavit itself. And it's pretty much what I have. Staff, again, will focus on your preferred option and anything. If option 1 is chosen by ZOAC, staff will forward that recommendation on to CPC and just let them know. If it's option 2 or 3, then we'll just continue to work internally and with our council and crafting the draft ordinance to bring back. With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
And so those are all essentially the priorities if we want to move forward with 1 or 2, correct?
Options 2 and 3.
2 and 3, excuse me, thank you. So I saw a couple of questions. Vice Chair Blair?
Well, yeah, I have a question as far as it goes along, buffering and tree and evergreen. This is asking for something more extensive than the existing Article 10, is that not correct?
Yes, it'd be alternative to Article 10 standard. It's based in landscaping for the use.
So we are looking at specific landscaping requirements and standards for just concrete batch plants that says that there is a more definitive greenscape, if you will, that must be adhered to for this particular.
Certainly, it's based on the function. It's much like utility services. We have specific landscape criteria where there's residential adjacencies. This is applying it to the same type of protocols for different operations for the use. We want the landscaping materials to have function, and knowing that time and wind are variables that we're taking into account. And because whatever they plant on the site, as they're young, they're going to have a different effect as they mature and as the area around it is developed.
So can I continue along that thing? Mr. Irwin, when it comes, okay, so when we look at plantings at the onset, when we're looking at a temporary facility, the greenscape never gets a chance to mature if the temporary use expires as it should, then the plantings will never mature. So is there a different requirement for the greenscape for a temporary versus a greenscape for a permanent?
There is no requirement for landscaping for temporary because the site will be developed and have its own landscaping requirements for whatever gets built there. This is only for the permanent plants.
So when we look at the like Mr. Reed says, our history, and the history has shown that there has been on numerous occasions temporary moves into permanent. If you don't put in any landscaping, whether it's a temporary or permanent, then and if we still see the mitigation or the migration of temporary moving to permanent, however it happens, then we don't have the ability to go back and put in any type of greenscape buffering.
Yes, they would not be able to just move from a temporary status and just get new regulations. They would not be able to do that transition without getting an SUP for a permanent batch plan, because that's what a permanent batch plan requires. So that would kick in all of the requirements of the permanent batch plan, which would include landscaping. And then but the expectation with the temporary facility is they're just there to pour the concrete needed for whatever development is going to develop. And the landscaping will be dictated by or required per whatever goes in, residential development or, whatever the landscaping requirements are for that particular use. Does that make sense?
I understand what you're saying. I may not agree, but I understand what you're saying.
Okay.
Fencing, you said that there was temp and permanent fencing requirements, and this is for permanent batch plants, I take it, correct? There was the permanent, and there was temporary and permanent fencing requirements, and I'm assuming that is also only for permanent batch plants and not temporary batch plants?
They're different. For the permanent batch plants, have put a permanent fence, solid screening for our requirements, brick, stone, or masonry type fence, minimum 8 foot tall.
Front and back? On the front and back of the property?
Yeah,
All sides?
all sides,
Mhm.
right, and then the landscaping as well. For the temporary plants, they have to put up a temporary fencing, okay, temporary to secure the site, and also puts either sound blankets or some landscaping or something with it to make it opaque as well. So they would use let's say they want to use a cyclone fence. We don't normally allow chain link fence, right? But we don't want that for permanent. But if they want to use that because it's not permanent, again, they're going to go away and want to they can't put up a masonry fence if they're going away, right? Then they can, let's say they put up a cyclone type fence. Well, it still needs to be opaque, so they can use either sound blankets and landscaping with it, something to make it opaque.
Okay, thanks.
Does that make sense?
I understand what you're saying. Okay, thank you.
Vice Chair Blair, Mr. McGregor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mine is a technical question, and don't know if you'll be able to answer Ms. Sellers if she's still here. So there's discussion here about in some of the requirements, if a batch plant uses green cement to create green concrete, then they get some breaks. And then you give us a link to define green cement, which is a very technical link. Thank you for challenging us, but I read it. And the gist of it is that green cement uses some of the waste from the kilns that make the cement, added back into the mix to make the concrete. So it reduces CO2 emissions, and there are all these things about it. I'd like to know more, either now or later, about what, in general terms, how common is the use of green cement so that we can consider whether or not every batch plant going forward should use green cement if the benefits are that great. And again, this technical paper, it's hard to say because it's one study made at some university in Paducah method deal.
I think in a previous meeting that came up that the city was not aware there was any green concrete being used.
Anyway,
Today.
Currently in the city.
oh, in the city.
As far as I know, now, the materials and everything I'm reading, it's becoming very attractive, and it's gonna become more the norm. We want to encourage it, and that's why I put it in here so that.
Yeah, and my question
Yeah.
would you to be to make the case as to why we shouldn't require it as
Yeah.
opposed to encourage it. Because if it is cheaper, because it's using waste from the cement, kilns use up a ton of energy to make cement out of sand or however that works. So, can we be bold without being unduly onerous to the industry? And perhaps we'll hear from the industry.
Thank you, Mr. Becker. Any other questions before we move to our public speakers?
Yes, one question here.
Yes, Commissioner Hopkins.
I may have missed this, but just wanted some clarity. Is there a trigger from a permanent status or from temporary status to a permanent status? Is that being considered?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Commissioner Pop, I'm going to restate your question. Was it that is there a trigger to go from a temporary to a permanent batch plan? Is that correct?
Yes, exactly.
Yes, the goal here, with the different land use categories, very specific, like temporary on-site, temporary off-site, permanent, or the goal is to have them CO'd, have a certificate of occupancy that corresponds with their use. The trigger is the time frame, really, because again, we're saying that the temporary has to go away after their 2 renewals, unless they get an SUP, a specific use permit, at which time, you know, they can be granted a longer length of time, but it still has to be tied to their construction contract. So, and then they, you know, they have to go away. You know, they just cannot stay. They have to remediate the site. They have to do all of that. So, and it would be an inspection too, that final inspection when they have the intent to vacate the site, they will contact, I want to say it's ZOAC, so that they can perform, you know, assessment of the site to make sure there's no remediation required or what have you. Basically letting them know they're okay to vacate the site. So yeah, that's basically the trigger there. If they say, well, we want to be permanent now, well, the answer is no. You don't have a certificate of occupancy for a permanent site. You have to go through the process, but you have to leave. You can't stay there and apply for it and just, you know, because then you're in violation of your certificate of occupancy. So you're going to have to pretty much vacate the site and then go through the SUP process to become a permanent batch plan and abide by all the regulations that whatever those end up to be, that are required for a permanent batch plan.
Unless they were to apply within the time frame that they could receive their SUP for permanency before their temporary permit lapsed, theoretically. But that would only be in a situation where it's an appropriate location for an SUP to be approved for a permanent batch plan, correct?
Right,
there are
sorry,
some
we had a
locations.
hard time hearing you, but yes, you were right. If something thought they were originally temporary and they evolve and want to become permanent, they would have to meet all the standards if option 3 is where we're going, of distances and, you know, improvements and site requirements and, you know, whatever it is that eventually, you know, rolls out, that new permanent, even though it used to be temporary, the new permanent would have to meet all the requirements of the permanent.
And that's only the case for option 3?
Well, option 3 is where we're adding new land uses, new land use categories. We're adding the by right options. And so if we stay with 1 or 2, we're not doing any by right options.
Okay, thank you so much for that clarity.
So I have one follow-up if I may. So on page 18 of our case report under renewals and extensions, it says when allowed by right, and this again, I think is all relative to temporary. It says there's a maximum of 2 extensions of 6-month periods per the updated construction contract, and then there's some other exceptions if there's other challenges. What would that expected total period be?
Yeah,
Is it 18 months?
It is.
Okay,
It is
so it's the
18
first
months.
is for 6 months, 2 6-month extension, and then again, if there's something that happened with construction that they can submit and prove up why they need something different, but the intent is it's 18 months or they have to move to permanent. Is that correct?
They'd have, well, they'd have to, right, well, they can get an SUP just to extend their time frame.
Okay.
You know,
Thank you.
they don't have to become permanent necessarily. They can say, okay, we need 3 more months or, you know, whatever it is.
Okay. So, Commissioner Popkin, thank you for that question, because I was trying to understand what that time period was as well. Okay. All right, so we are going to hear from our registered speakers, and then we'll come back for our discussion and direction for staff. We have 2 registered speakers signed up. I think I saw one of our speakers online. We have Ms. Bazan. And I think I see you online. Yes, could you please state your name and address for the record? You'll have 3 minutes.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Honorable Chair and Committee members. Catherine Bazan, 10456 Vinemont Street. I do apologize. I missed a portion of this morning's briefing, so if my comments don't reflect the discussion this morning, that may be why. But I want to just start by thanking staff for really diligently listening to the feedback from all of our stakeholders. I will not be able to support option 1, where we take no additional action to address the concerns of our community. And I urge you to continue to pursue option 3 and work through the details of implementation, no matter how arduous that they may be, with input from the community. I think throughout the engagement, we heard many voices expressing the way that these facilities negatively impact the health and well-being of our neighbors. The various proposed remedies, actually some of the solutions that our community advocates have been asking for. Not to use this opportunity to adequately the problems that we have seen with these facilities for decades. And I think we need to emphasize the buffer distances. We know the closer a pollution source is to a community and a sensitive land use, the more opportunity it has to negatively impact it. At the Mill Creek Batch Plant, Commissioner DeRoe and I successfully advocated for a 16-foot screening wall with sound blankets. And this is an excellent mechanism, if maintained, to control and mitigate fugitive emissions. Regarding public notice, communities should be notified and have adequate opportunities to have their voices heard on this important issue. And I urge you to strongly consider establishing a compliance date for those non-conforming uses. I have some additional comments that I'm going to put in writing and send time this morning, and I just want to again say thanks to Ms. Levy and PUD staff for their diligence on this. I think it's probably safe to say that Ms. Levy dreams about batch plans regularly. So thank you again for your time.
Thank you for being with us, Ms. Bazan. Our second registered speaker is Evelyn Mayo.
She had to step out. She is emailing her comments to Ms. Levy.
Okay, so those will be distributed.
Yes.
Thank you. All right, so those were our 2 registered speakers. Do we have anyone in the audience who would like to speak? Thank you for being with us. Thank you, ma'am. Yes, sir. If you'll please begin with your address. And I will say, don't touch that. It's live in the, we can hear you and they can hear you online.
Commissioners, volunteer committee members, staff, thank you. My name is Trey Brown, Big City Crushed Concrete, 11143 Goodnight Lane in Dallas. This is me and my family's company and industry that you are discussing. Concrete recycling was lumped in this discussion at the last minute, and we've not been involved in any preliminary discussions or inquiries. I want you all to know that this industry is more highly regulated by current TCEQ standards than the other industries in this discussion. Setbacks, receptors, fugitive emissions are all more stringent than the batch plants or the hot mix asphalt plants you're discussing at length. As Public Works weighed in on these potential changes, it will certainly completely change their daily capacities and operations. They use our facilities every day. Staff from City Environmental is here. However, I don't believe they've ever been to in our state's Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, with hundreds of engineers and experts and generations of experience. Our city has 2 concrete recycling companies, both are family owned. and have operated harmoniously within our city for up to 35 years. We are only 4 sites and already comply with stringent SUP requirements. You have given consideration to green concrete batch plants, of which we're not sure there are any in the city, but they're given special consideration. I request you give consideration to the greenest and largest recycling businesses in our city, which are our concrete recycling businesses. We are here, we are necessary, we're authorized. We are not temporary, and we are a critical part of the maintenance and growth of our city's infrastructure. Exclude us from this discussion and allow us to continue providing our services to and for the city of Dallas as we have for 35 years. Thank you.
Thank you for being with us. Yes, ma'am. If you please start with your name and address for the record. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you. Thank y'all for having this meeting, Ms. Lady, for doing this work. My name is Tamika DeRoe. I live at 7931 Kilster Street, Dallas, Texas, 75216 in the Joplin community. I'm also the environmental commissioner for the city of Dallas for District 7. And I'm standing here in front of y'all to give you a personal input of how this ordinance will protect my quality of health living in the city of Dallas. The buffers around the facilities will protect my community of Joplin of 700 residents from the dust when the wind is blowing. The regulations for the 500 feet notice, some of these batch companies are in areas where the residence is farther than the 200 land notification. So the 500 feet notification is very important to community input. Thirdly, about batch plants and how they're affecting the community. I heard y'all say the batch plants are mostly in District 8 and District 6. I live in District 7. I live on that quarter of District 8 and 310 FTU right. It goes from Highway 20 all the way down to I-30 on SM right. And I live amongst that. So if we're gonna include District 8 and 6, please include District 7. Because around Joplin, it's 3 batch plants around Joplin on the same lot with SUPs. And so this 50 feet distance, distant regulation with batch plants being far apart from each other and not all in one area, that would protect my quality of health in Joplin. So I just wanted to inform y'all how some of these implementations and things, options in this ordinance will help communities of people like me in Joplin, in West Dallas, in District 8. And so I'm just asking y'all to please consider, moving forward this phase 2 to protect the health of communities in the city of Dallas. And I'm working with the commission in the city of Dallas to try to change some of these old racist injustice that we face living in these communities around industrial. And so please consider passing this phase to protect the residents of the city of Dallas and my health too, and my children, and my grandkids. I live in Southern Dallas, and that's where it's at, in Southern Dallas. It's not in North Dallas, it's in Southern Dallas. So please take into consideration these options and pass this ordinance. Thank you.
Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
Are there any other speakers here?
Morning, ZOAC member, city staff, Neil Matthews, North Behind 2201 Main Street, Suite 1280, Dallas. Thank you, staff member Larry. She has been wonderful trying to coordinate these tours with you. We wanted to invite each of you to a private tour of the facility and reiterate, we hope you understand that making the facilities open to the public is very challenging for a variety of reasons. But we do want to extend that invitation to you. And just remember that batch plans are necessary for the construction industry and the road building as well. But you're going through phases of trying to see which one or these options, I'm sorry, I'm trying to speak about, please keep that in mind as well. Thank you.
Thank you for being with us today. Do we have any other speakers? All right, so that concludes our public speakers for today. Members, did you have any questions for staff from comments received as we begin discussion? Yes, Commissioner Carpenter.
Ms. Levy, can we clarify, is concrete crushing part of what we're discussing, or my understanding is what we're discussing is limited to concrete and asphalt batching? Is concrete crushing a completely different?
That is correct. We had staff did look at that. At the end of the day, we felt like although they locate sometimes very nearby on the same site, they are a different use. They're more recycling and not the concrete and asphalt batching. Admittedly, there's a lot of industrial uses like that particular use that is considered potentially incompatible, that maybe needs to be looked at globally at some point. But batch plant is our main charge to try to address.
So it is any recommendation we make today is pertaining to asphalt and concrete batch plants only.
That's correct. Right, you're saying.
And again, I'm just going to restate it to make sure I've heard this correctly. What's before us today and for our recommendation we're making, it's specific to consideration of amending concrete or asphalt batch plant uses, and then not limited to industrial uses. There's no consideration of concrete crushing.
Not at this time.
Thanks.
Correct.
So, and hopefully that responds to part of our speaker's comments. So, Mr. McGregor, you had a question?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I'd also like to follow up based on what the gentleman in the public talked about, the concerns about green cement. Would you please follow up with industry and someone like his company to understand better? The president spoke, I think, 3 minutes, to give us a lot of information, but is it not feasible for a company like this to use green cement? Is it not available? Is it, it would just be able to understand what, in a little better detail, what are the obstacles for that? Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McGregor. Mr. Hall.
Yeah, just to think, one, we just heard 2 industry reps offer up tours, so I was, there's maybe an opportunity to schedule a tour.
Right. I think Ms. Levy can speak to that, or Ms. May, do you want to speak to it?
Well, I think, depending on what options we're going with, whatever your decision is going to be today, I believe we do intend to, we have the addresses of the industries, and I think we're.
And on the tour aspect, in the past, there was concern that y'all would like to see the same things, be in the same conversation in the theoretical tour of some batch plans. And the rules of the committee would be that if there's a quorum of members, then we have to post it as a public meeting. And therefore, the public can join. And so that was part of the concern of why it didn't happen as a tour for the committee. It's because they didn't want to open it up.
Can I ask a question then? If individuals want to prevail themselves of the invitation that has been extended by Ms. Matthews or Mr. Trey Brown, I knew it was a B, but I didn't know, and I knew it was a color. Is there the opportunity then for the members to individually go to each one of them and say, can I see the facility?
I think that might be a question
For legal?
Suzanne.
Yeah.
I believe, I would like to verify that and double check before I confirm one way or the other on that, but I believe it might be.
Okay. So then will you let us know? Send us an email and.
And I think Ms. Moyer may have a
Hi,
comment.
yes, I'm Megan, Service Area Planning Manager. I just wanted to speak on that a little bit. We discussed that internally, and we don't have a budget for a bus tour right now. That's not something that's typically been done by ZOAC, so we haven't accounted for it in the budget, and it can be quite costly. So, we would be happy to, if we get confirmation that you guys could visit on your own, or if you decide to do so individually, we can certainly provide a list of addresses and a map or something, some resources to help you do that. But in terms of us organizing and funding, that's probably not something that we're able to do. Yeah.
That would be fine if we had the information. Who do we contact? Where do we go?
Or would we go to those individual parties that said that they've extended the invitation for us to go and see?
That would be a good place to start. And since, Ms. Matthews very kindly extended that offer, that would be a good place to start.
Mr. Brown?
And yes, and Mr. Brown.
Who's excluded.
Yeah.
But once facilities are certainly available, so you'll have understanding of what we do.
So Ms. May, Ms. Levy, your guys are gonna confirm with city attorney's office and you will circle back with us to give us advice on that.
And I guess we would hold off on doing, of us asking for that tour until we've gotten confirmation from from legal, how we can proceed or not.
And
yes, Mr. Hall.
One more thing, I really like the link about the Guinea concrete, and I too read the paper, very interesting. If you've come across any more links about new technology in this industry, a slower setting concrete, smaller trucks, whatever that may be out there on the horizon, to me at least, that would be interesting for consideration, because I'm not sure it's going to be status quo forever. And if we're changing ordinances and stuff, it might be nice to know what the future might be.
Sure, and I think there is a link there. I can't remember, I'm sorry, but, and I know we brought this up before. One trend, at least in some other areas, is to put these uses in a building, which, at that point, these wouldn't apply. It would just go under regular industrial development in a building.
Okay, just anything of interest about new technology, new concepts.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. Okay, so I think our next step is to give staff direction on our priorities and our thoughts on the ordinances. So opening it up for discussion. Mr. Rick?
To me, option number 3 makes sense. It seems to give staff the most ability to create nuanced language. It addresses a significant issue that's been brought up about the temporary batch plans and their the honors requirements that are there now. So what I understand is that whatever option we go with, you'll come back with something that's a little more crystallized in terms of language for us to look at it. And, so it's option 3 for me, and I would just say again, or reiterate that I'd also be interested in learning about a long-term strategy to stop the concentration of these plants in 6, 8, 7, and essentially south of the river.
The temporary and permanent, or?
Not temporary, because I think temporary is going to be connected to the. Yes. No, I mean.
Thank you, Ms. McGregor.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Ms. Bagley?
I would support option 3 as well, because it does cover a lot of the questions, and instead of having SUPs that are to the site or specific, it gives continuity or consistency in what would be required for batch plants.
Thank you, Ms. Bagley. Speakers online?
This is Mark.
Mr.
Yes, I'm option number 3 as well. I feel like if we say SUP, that's certainly the path of least resistance. But we don't have a chance to do an option 2 or 3. I think if we go the full route, and do 3, we can always back off of that a little bit and we can look at it and we can, we can come back. But if we just do SUP, then we're just done. So I'm option number 3 guy myself.
Thank you. Other discussion? Commissioner Carpenter?
I also support option 3. I do see that there are situations in which allowing temporaries by right makes sense, considering the amount of time that it could take now to get an SUP. I think that's just the reality of living in a city where there's development going on. It's a necessity, so I think that's a reasonable situation. I think that, I think these criteria that you're looking at all make sense. I mean, you're going to come back with a revised recommendation. I think the distances with notification requirement, landscape screening, site requirements, site restoration or remediation considered. Several batch plants, abandoned batch plants in D6 are just sitting there in various states. So,
unhealthiness.
Yeah, that'll work right there. I think there's some tweaks that are definitely needed. I think the size of the lot right now is not adequate. I think we're going to look at it. You look at an acre, which is basically say 200 by 200, and you have to come in 50 feet from each property line. That leaves you with 100 feet by 100 feet. I've never seen a batch plant that can accommodate, the piles and the, everything 100 by 100. And also, if we're going to put a minimum requirement for a lot size, I think that probably needs to be outside of the floodplain, because if you have unusable areas, you shouldn't be counting that as part of your area. I have real reservations about any auto renewals or permanent batch plants. It's just, I make this speech all the time at SUP, at CDC. An SUP can just be a ticket for a permanent status. And concrete batch, asphalt batch, they're just too intensive uses to just give them a ticket to perpetuity. Because right now, the way the trigger for making it go back before a public hearing is very burdensome for affected neighbors. Because most of the time in the industrial area, everyone who's living within that notification, or everyone who owns property within that notification area is another industrial. So it's just, and areas just do change. And so keeping concrete batch plants, in one situation for, 5 years and more, 5 years and more, 5 years and more, 5 years, I just don't think it's good policy. I can understand in an initial 5-year period, you've got a significant investment, but giving them a possibility for just an endless for 5 years of no public hearing, something I would ever accept.
Thank you, Commissioner Carpenter. And I guess that is one, as we're talking about option 3, are there other considerations from the body in terms of what those standards are? There other standards that we think should be part of this discussion as staff is developing it? Are there things that we think are either priorities or that are maybe not there that should be a consideration?
Thank you for bringing that up, Madam Chair, because I did have something in mind. I just forgot completely to bring it up. I've heard in prior discussions with members of the industry that there are some tools to reduce dust or mechanisms to reduce that. I think one time I heard with water and spray down and so forth. It would be helpful to have a better idea of what that is, how that works, and whether or not it should be included in the language in some instances as a requirement. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. McGregor. Yeah.
I would like to add something to that. I think what Ms. Levy alluded to earlier is quite correct, and Ms. May, that a lot of these criteria I think would be better included in a checklist and not in the ordinance itself. That does reflect the fact that standards do change. And and I also want to stress what I've made before is that I hope that this checklist is subject to independent visual verification by city staff, because that is where the gaping hole has been in the current permitting, the TCEQ, is that these owners sign a self-reported checklist that certain things are present when anyone could see that they're not. So I think that alone would go a great distance for getting some of these places into a situation where they're not as invasive, intrusive,
impactful. It's good. Only put, what's necessary that's not going to change any static things that.
So, members online? So the only, I think, two items that I wanted to note through all of this discussion is, I think we, in terms of auto renewals, we have other uses in our code that are not eligible for auto renewal. And so as staff is evaluating that option, if there's any consideration for this use in that terms as you're evaluating that, I think might be helpful for the body to understand. And also just one kind of general question I had when we were talking about the temporary on-site uses, when we start looking at our denser environments, where we're redeveloping, whether it be uptown, downtown, I'm sure there are areas throughout the city, has the industry indicated that there is a need for on-site temporary, or do they by and large utilize the permanent batch plants? If there's, is there any consideration when we're talking about temporary by right that we think might be a consideration as we develop those conditions? If I said that well enough to be understood. That was a little circular. So those were my final. So is there, I think what I've heard is we'd like to see option 3 come back. I think generally with all of the standards that are in there, I think perhaps consideration of what's appropriate in a checklist versus what's in proposed SUP conditions. And then consideration of how auto renewal may or may not work and what that period might be. And then this your item that you added.
Looking at green cement.
Green concrete. And the use of green. Is anything else we need to do as a body that instead of simply encouraging that might be a more robust consideration on green concrete?
If it's just in the experimental stage,
Right.
then there's no reason to give it a lot of consideration, but if it's something that is tried and tested, then we should know more about it.
I had a comment, but I think
With respect to green concrete, that we're using green concrete, I think we need to probably, if we do use green concrete as a term, it needs to be defined as to what green concrete really constitutes. Because I know from like hardy plank, it's cementatious, something. And so I think you need to get into what is it, rather than just.
Exactly, you mean,
Absolutely. Yes.
The best practices for it.
There is.
The best practices for it.
Yeah.
The
Excellent
existing.
point. All right, so does staff need more detailed direction? Is that?
I think it's good. I had one comment that I thought of. I think we touched on it before, but I just want to make sure, because I know we talked so much about historical, and I understand that, that's what we work with, right? Our historical and what's happened. There are some, and I don't know all because there's over 1,000 PDs, but I do know there are a few, at least some PDs that specifically allow, in the PD ordinance, temporary batch plants, or maybe even, I don't think permanent, but there could be, but they do allow specifically, listed in the PD temporary plants. So that's something, we're not going to be able to address, is what I'm saying. Something that's already out there, in a PD. I just want to put that out there because.
I understand.
There'll be a checklist there would still be a checklist, or there will be evolving a checklist that temporary batch plants would have.
Right. But I can't stop. I mean, we can't,
So, I'm sorry, so your concern is reference to the earlier comment, what deconcentrating or avoiding concentration of batch plants in some areas, because is what I hear from you saying that if an area is already, it's already built up PDs, then there's no, you can't just create new use for them somewhere else. Is that what it is, or? I'm trying to get the context of your.
I think what she's saying is that when we have a PD that lists the permitted uses,
Right.
we probably have some legacy PDs that say temporary concrete batch plant by special authorization.
I see.
And they're not being
they've listed out
change
the
that by
uses.
right.
Yeah, they've listed out the uses that are already allowed in that PD, and so it doesn't default back to 51A. And so we can't address those because they're existing, is what I'm saying. So there will be some, that are already allowed by PD that we just can't control, existing PDs.
Ms. Bagley, but if that PD is amended or what we call cracked open, then I think it needs to be, the batch plant could be addressed in that, under those conditions.
It would
If
have
they're
to
old,
be
like,
handled
that
at that
needs to
time,
just be,
yes.
it's like, for years, we've had taxidermy as permitted uses.
Yes.
I mean, they don't get out, I mean, really. So I think it's the thing, because I saw several PDs amended to not have taxidermy. So I think if you look at that, I know that's an extra check for PDs, but I don't think you're gonna have that many, but I think they might be relevant as to where they're located, particularly with adjacent residential that's happened since the PD.
But a question, can I ask a question on that? And I think that, sorry, thank you, but I think I also have the answer. In those particular occasions, it would be incumbent upon the commissioner who is reviewing that PD to see and strike it out or act accordingly, not up to staff to say we're opening up a PD and you're going to reevaluate this use within that PD.
No, it would have to come
from
in the
so-
intermediate. It's not from the applicant, not from the staff. It's got to be looked at because we should, as former commissioner, we should look at.
Absolutely.
Correct.
Yeah, but it just won't be part of this. and
No,
that
no, it
was-
will be part of it, but it needs to just
Be in our mind.
be in our minds.
Thank you, Ms. Bagley. Good observation. So I think the other things that as staff is looking at, we talked about the map and the different criteria that will be part of this as when it comes back to us at the appropriate time. Okay, Tony, we've captured everything and staff is clear. Okay, so that's.
Yes, and so we still have the links also at some point with I don't know when, from the industry, when they get that video.
He'll
send
distribute
that
to
out.
us in the total map and so staff is also gonna respond to us on our tools. Those are three action items. Yeah. So you'll respond to us, so for option 3, as we
And
discussed.
Suzanne, I'm sorry, will let us know about the separate tours.
And then we'll bring back the map when option 3 comes back to us.
Yes.
Date TBD as you're developing the ordinance, draft ordinance. Okay. So I believe that closes out our discussion item. We have one other matter on our agenda, which is the approval of the February 28th, 2023 meeting minutes. Is there a motion on the minutes? Thank you, Mr. McGregor. Do we have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Commissioner Blair. And that is approved of meeting minutes as submitted.
Yes.
Thank you. Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Minutes are adopted. That is our last agenda item. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Thank you, Commissioner Blair, Vice Chair Blair. Is there a second? Thank you, Mr. Hall. You got in just in front of you. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? We are adjourned.
I don't believe we ever have anyone opposed.
11:29 a.m. I want to thank our members, all of city staff and beyond for being with us today and being part of the conversation. We'll see you in our next meeting.
I just think for heck of it, one day I'm going to oppose the